Hello and welcome to Open Dialogue. Hybrid wars, psychological warfare, cyber terrorism, concepts and ideas that you might have heard of, may have touched on. Certainly in my profession, I'm increasingly coming across this terminology. And in relation to the Middle East, where a lot of the Muslim world obviously resides, we've got bags of it. We've seen Lebanon and we've seen protesters who are still maintaining their protests, many rioting. We've seen it happen in Iraq, and we've seen it pop up in Iran over the last few days. Not only that, we saw it in Egypt under the rule of Sisi. What is this business of hybrid warfare? Are these protests and these riots, these demonstrations that go on, are they actually just only the people themselves rising up, or is there something a little bit deeper going on there? With me in the studio to discuss the details of what hybrid warfare means and what often lies behind the headlines, behind the scenes, is Dr. Marcus Papadopoulos. Welcome.
Thank you very much for having me back on.
Lovely to have you back. And of course we have Hujjatul Islam wal Muslimin, Sayyid Muhammad Razavi. Welcome, Aga.
Thank you.
We're going to dissect this. Hopefully I have a short report, I think, which focuses on the Islamic Republic of Iran and its problems. We'll have that with you very shortly, as soon as studio give me the word. But perhaps I can come to you first, Marcus. What is hybrid warfare in the context of some of those issues I raised around people protesting about economics or corruption? Let's just have, first of all, a definition of what it might be.
Well, first of all, hybrid warfare is a term which is new to a great many people in Britain and in the wider world. However, hybrid warfare has been around for many, many years. Essentially, hybrid warfare is waging war against another country in unconventional means, using propaganda, using provocateurs, using violent protests in order for one country to achieve a geostrategic objective in another country. That is essentially what hybrid warfare is. And as I said, for a lot of people, it is a new term. But as we will hopefully see in this discussion, this has been going on for decades.
Well, Marcus is the head of Politics First and lives part-time, or maybe even full-time, in the Houses of Parliament, that bastion of democracy which we all talk about. Actually, I would argue that that bastion of democracy is also involved in cyber warfare, possibly cyber terrorism, where it suits it. So again, we're going to probably have a little look at our own responsibility as British citizens and checking out our own track record in this country, abroad. But the Americans seem to be the ones that pop up most on this radar, as well as the Israelis. We'll go into all of these issues because they relate to the Middle East and a lot of the, if you like, problems that arise there. We have a short video of relating to basically the Islamic Republic of Iran and the protests that have been going on there just recently. Join us after this video for further discussion.
We've seen the riots in Hong Kong, the protests, and the core of that protest movement is funded by the United States, by State Department front groups and all the sort of usual suspects. The same, of course, we saw in Venezuela. The same we recently saw with this fascist coup in Bolivia, a really vicious, brutal coup that the U.S. sanctioned and all U.S. leadership supported. The U.S. record on human rights is among the worst in the world. I mean, dating back to, the genocide of indigenous peoples in the U.S., Jim Crow, mass incarceration, all of this. It is a racist, white supremacist nation that is, in which inequality is acute. The U.S. crimes across the globe are massive right now. It is the aggressor nation. It is the rogue nation right now.
Well, that's an opinion from our colleague there on a report for Press TV. But Maulana Sayyid Muhammad Raza, you've been a keen follower of the Islamic Revolution in Iran and what's been happening in Iran for years, and we're using that as a case study for hybrid warfare. Ayatollah Khamenei has pointed to it. I think Mr. Laranjani has also pointed it. So has Mr. Rouhani. They all seem to be echoing this idea that what's happened in Iran is yet another example of, if you like, a kind of a subversive war, not conventional war, but unconventional war. What are your experiences of hybrid warfare and how it's impacted certainly Iranian-American relations and how it's been panning out there?
Yeah, I mean, we have been hearing for many years that third world war is going to start. I think it's already started, because the third world war is not going to be the way the first and second were, and hybrid war is a kind of an example which is going on not only in Iran, Venezuela, Cuba, and other countries. I recently visited and personally witnessed what is going on.
Well, Bolivia at the moment.
Yeah, Bolivia is right at the moment. Chile has been also victim as well. So these are the tools that, as Marcus was saying, are used for many decades to overthrow the government and implement their own ideology and way of thinking. So Iran is not, alone in this war, and there are many who easily become victims of this kind of propaganda, and they join this kind of war.
Marcus, coming back to the people and the media, it seems as though one of the key tools that is being used is the media. It's not new. We talked about Goebbels, we've talked about propaganda done by the British Empire itself, we've talked about Americans in Iran in the 50s when they hired ruffians and people in the bazaar. The Rashidi brothers, I think, were quoted as being one gang, which was employed by the CIA to overthrow the legitimate democratically elected leader Mossadegh at that time, and was replaced by the despotic Shah of Iran. So Iran has track record with Americans. The CIA has a track record that goes back as far as the 50s. But actually hybrid warfare is not new. It's just that it seems that today, with the internet, with Facebook, with social media, with all these new modern means of communication, there seems to be a greater power and efficiency that's available to those who want to interfere with other sovereign nations' internal affairs.
Yes, I'd agree with that. Hybrid warfare, as you just said, has been around for many decades. Iran was a victim of that in the early 1950s. And I would draw a parallel between hybrid warfare and the Nazi Germany's military doctrine of blitzkrieg, in that you know what's coming. So, for example, after the German conquest of Poland and France, other countries in Europe knew what was coming. There would be the air bombardments, then there would be the artillery, then the tanks and the soldiers would go in. Now, hybrid warfare, if we look at it, first of all, we see protesters taken to the streets in a geostrategic country which follows an independent foreign policy and does not bow down to the diktats of Washington. So protesters take to the streets. Then mainstream media, broadcast and print start giving a lot of exposure to these protesters. Then you start hearing about the tyrannical rule of the president of this country, of the government of this country. Then audiences in the West start hearing about these horrific human rights abuses. Then these NGOs in my opinion, in inverted commas, start hyping up the pressure on those presidents, on those governments. And then you see these protesters, they're not just random protesters, they're very well organized, they're very well trained. They know how to use modern means to get their messages across, for example, social media. And, you know, I would cite the example of what happened in Serbia in October 2000. When many people today think about hybrid warfare, they think about, for example, Venezuela, or indeed Bolivia, or indeed Iran, or indeed Hong Kong. But what we are seeing today was really born in Serbia in October 2000 because you had a movement called Otpor, which was completely under the control of the Americans and the British, and they trained these people in hybrid warfare techniques. And of course they were very successful because what they did was they overthrew Slobodan Milosevic, they brought their people to power, and then those people gave Serbia on a golden platter to the West. That's where it all started. So if people today really want to understand hybrid warfare, look what happened in Serbia in October 2000. But as you said, we are seeing it in many other countries today, and I do believe it is like blitzkrieg. You know what's coming, and you have to focus on, especially in my opinion, on these so-called NGOs, because I believe that's actually the Achilles heel of America's hybrid warfare.
Well, Morana, Iran actually, I think, shut down British Council, for instance. Now, British Council is effectively a cultural arm of the British in terms of foreign policy, and it's supposed to be quite benign, where they roll out soft cultural expressions from British culture into other environments. Is that part of it? That part of it is also a cultural invasion. So in that context, and Marcus excellently defined the process, but people often imagine that this propaganda that begins at the beginning of any coup d'etat, any colour revolution, any, if you like, overthrow of a particular regime that the Americans don't want or the British don't want in power, they think it starts with sort of probably a much more narrow level than it actually does. Because I could argue that Hollywood could also form part. The Hollywood film industry, the pop industry, could also form part of a cultural invasion of other lands long before the Americans start trying to get politically their hands on a particular, if you like, arena. And Iran again, is a classic example because if you like, the Islamic culture, the Islamic way of life has many things which collide with Western or American neo-capitalism or hyper-capitalism, if you like. There are a lot of intrinsic differences, usury countering the idea of sort of money lending and usury in the way it's done, for instance, by the Americans and a lot of the capitalists who drive the world economy. So there are some inherent clashes which don't sit well. Maybe also the reason that these hybrid wars are begun on particularly a nation like Iran, which stands for certain principles. Do you think that actually that cultural invasion is something that the general public is actually aware of, that they're already subject to a hybrid warfare when they're imbibing cultural, if you like, messages through lots of American war films, for instance, etc.?
Yeah, I mean, people, if they are aware of what is happening, and if they are intelligent, they should all look at what's happening in the Western world. None of the Western world countries are having these hybrid wars. So this is a pattern that is developing in the world which doesn't agree with so-called superpowers. So this is what we need to do. This is what the authorities in Iran or the countries where these problems are happening should make people aware and educate them of the nature of this kind of war.
Because the media is good at often highlighting, and as Marcus alluded to, the media likes to highlight the symptoms. So we all chase the news, we'll watch the news and we get these sound bites. And what's not happening is understanding the root causes or the context of that news. So people are absorbing information from a lot of these news agencies, which are largely run by state operators that work for the money lenders and work for the imperialist powers. But they're not understanding that a lot of the news they're being given doesn't tell them the root causes. So the root cause of hybrid warfare, they won't even know about hybrid warfare, let alone the root causes of it. Then what they would see is Iranians running across streets, breaking gasoline pumps, and then people will think, oh, there's trouble. That's where the majority of the lack of education or the political literacy, I think, exists. How do we educate people more, other than programs like this?
Yes, I mean, I think the education should start from very early stages of education in the in the schools, and especially when the teenagers ages start becoming alert or aware of these political developments. If these subjects are taught in the system, in the schools, I think it might create awareness, because at the moment everybody is blind, because there is no doubt there are economical problems, and economical problems are not native, they have been created by outsiders,
Well,
like with imposing sanctions, and so and they have imposed sanctions to develop this hybrid war later
So
on.
the economic terrorism which America is unleashing on the likes of Venezuela and Iran and Bolivia then leads to people being poor, and then they blame who? Their own government. They don't see that actually the real problem is a much wider systemic one, which is coming from probably outside the country. Well, we're going to keep on this subject because there's so many fascinating angles to this hybrid warfare that we can unravel further. But join us after this short video.
Is saying that he stands with the Iranian people, but what he really is indicating, of course, is that he stands with any Iranians who are crazy enough to riot and commit crimes to spread chaos, anarchy, and destruction, or what Muslims call fitna, in Iran. Pompeo, unsurprisingly, favors chaos, anarchy, and destruction throughout the region. That has been the policy of successive U.S. administrations, and now Pompeo is working for maybe the most chaotic of U.S. presidents, Donald Trump. The policy of destabilization of Middle Eastern nations that don't follow Washington's line is continuing, and it's interesting that Pompeo is the point man here, because on the very same day that it was reported that Pompeo was encouraging rioters in Iran, who of course are not standing up for principle, they're standing up for, they want gasoline to drive their cars around. Of course, there are some Iranians who have good reasons to protest and who are standing on principle, but the rioters presumably are rather selfish and spoiled brats who are merely interested in their own lifestyle. And so Pompeo he likes that. He wants more of that. But on the same day that it's reported that he is encouraging that kind of criminal behavior in Iran, he is being pilloried on the front page of the New York Times by none other than the Zionist, his Zionist colleague, I should say, Thomas Friedman. And Thomas Friedman is saying that Pompeo is the most corrupt and disgusting person that has yet been seen in U.S. diplomacy. I think a direct quote is Friedman says that Pompeo's behavior is one of the most shameful things I've seen in 40 years of covering U.S. diplomacy. Friedman says that Pompeo must have graduated last in his class at West Point in ethics. And this, of course, is not related to Pompeo's destabilizing the Middle East and trying to spread chaos there, but rather Pompeo's spreading chaos in Ukraine on behalf of Donald Trump, where Trump's mafia lieutenant, Rudy Giuliani, was trying to conduct a private organized crime foreign policy on behalf of Trump and Trump's Russian mafia controllers. And the State Department professionals pushed back, and some got fired, including Marie Yovanovitch. So Pompeo, rather than behaving ethically, according to Friedman, went ahead and got on the side of organized crime, didn't stand up for the professional diplomats. That's just the least of his crimes and his lack of ethics. Actually, it's the larger U.S. Zionist cause of taking down the Middle East, preventing it from ever being peaceful, united, and prosperous, that is the real scandal. The U.S. has murdered millions of people in Iraq and elsewhere in the wars launched on the big lie of September 11th, 2001. And these war criminals, including Pompeo, should be ashamed of themselves, saying that they're on the side of anybody in the Middle East. They're not. They're on the side of destroying the lives of the people of the Middle East, keeping the Middle East divided and in chaos for the benefit of Israel.
Well, I think a very clear-cut narrative, which I think supports a lot of what Marcus and Maulana Sayyid Muhammad Razavi have been pointing out here. But he raised a couple of interesting points there, which maybe you'll want to expand on. But this notion that actually there's an actual set-out policy, which means that they want to balkanize, and that'll relate to a lot of your kind of background as well, to balkanize the Middle East, to fragment it, to break up and to cause chaos, not allow peace to be had. Well, most Muslims, I hear a lot of Muslims who live in that part of the world, or Christians, or whoever happens to be in the Middle East, the first thing they usually do is moan about their own leaders. Now, when I look at the array of leaders that are in place in the Middle East, the bulk of them have graduated through Harvard or Oxbridge, and they are the sons of rich kids. They've been trained here in Sandhurst and whatnot, manufactured, sent back. They live in elitist zones in their own territories. They don't really relate to the people. So they're effectively imposed dictators or monarchs, largely. They aren't Islamic, because in an Islamic system, that isn't the way that, it's certainly not the way the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, was, or the way he behaved politically. We dealt with that in the last program, but I'm kind of trying to relate this idea how easy it is for ordinary folk to become quite narcissistic, quite individualistic, quite selfish. That becomes a weakness which the likes of Pompeo and Trump can exploit, because if you've got leaders who are being undermined economically, and then they can't keep the roofs over people's heads, they can't feed people 100% clearly, like in Iraq, for instance, 2 wars and the kind of the decimation and the post-war trauma combined with unscrupulous politicians. Of course, that's a natural ground for hybrid warfare to take place. How do we get out of this kind of circular trap that people are being put into? As you can see that there's a huge ring there, but the victims ultimately are the people, and actually it's the people who are also used then to go after even the good leaders that they have, perhaps. How do we break up that cycle, Marcus?
Well, first of all, we need to recognise that America's hybrid warfare is formidable, is absolutely potent, and one of the reasons for why it is so devastatingly successful is because the Americans have homed in on something which is innate in many human beings, whether they are Christian, whether they are Muslim, whether they are Hindu, whether they're Sikh, and that is individualism. And that is something the Americans have played to great effect for decades upon decades upon decades. What they say to people in the Middle East or in North Africa or in Hong Kong or in Latin America or in the Balkans is, forget the community, think about yourself. Don't think about your fellow neighbours, don't think about your fellow family members. You think about yourself, you think about how much money you can collect, how much materialism you can gather. And you know what? The system that we're offering you to replace that current system in your country is a system that can give you as much money as you can possibly have, as much materialism as you can possibly have. And regrettably, many human beings, because that is innate in them, materialism, in my opinion, is more pronounced than spiritualism in many human beings. Those people, they fall for that from what they're hearing from the Americans, and that is a way the Americans, they get a foothold. And then there's the culture element in hybrid warfare, where the Americans, they start to tackle a country's culture, and the Americans know that if you can destroy a people's culture, then effectively you've destroyed the national identity of those people. And if their national identity is gone, then there's going to be no one in that country that is going to oppose this American system that they're going to introduce. Absolutely. And we have to say the Americans have been unbelievably successful. What we need, wherever you are in the world, is to put spiritualism, is to put humanity, is to put compassion before materialism. Materialism is, in my opinion, an evil. And that needs to be told time and time and time again. The Americans tell people in Bolivia, in Venezuela, in Ukraine, in Serbia, that if you want heaven on earth, adopt the system in Britain, adopt the system in America. Well, people come from Iran because they've fallen for that. They come to Britain, they see the reality, they end up living in hostels, they end up doing all sorts of horrendous jobs where they are economically exploited. And what do? They contact the Iranian embassy in London and ask them, please, can you help us to go back to Iran? Because, you know, Britain is not heaven on earth.
Yeah, there are fundamental flaws. We have a caller online. Welcome, caller. Your comment or your question?
Yeah, Assalamu alaikum, Mohsin.
Alaikum salam.
Assalamu alaikum, Maulana, and salam to your guest, doctor. Mohsin, I've been listening to this. I mean, there's too many texts, but what is the main cause of it? To me, I feel it's the currency domination, because everything is dependent on dollar. Now, naturally, the dollar is American currency, so everything, whatever you do, is all dollar related. So if they want to put the economic into shambles, you know, like what's happened to Iran, you know, they can't trade. And there are many countries they can't trade. Now, even their currency will depend what American wants to deal with their local currency with dollars. So the third world country is sweating their heads off to match, and they are dominated by the Americans. It's slavery. I mean, it is somehow, it's a slavery. You listen to us or you will be punished. We are going to punish you so hard that you probably might even starve to death. So I think it's dominant of the currency rather than anything. If Iran could trade in its local currency, then I don't think Iran would be in this situation, or any other countries. If you see the third world countries, usually the third world countries are the biggest sufferers because they want them to be under them, and they want to slave them to their ways. So naturally, cultural and everything will come under that. They will say, listen to us, we want this, or you are going to be punished. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Some very powerful statements there, which we're going to pick up. We've talked about cultural elements within this hybrid war, which we are all imbibing, and they come through our screens, on our movie sets, in our music, in our poetry. We seem to have it surrounding us. What Brother Azad has raised is the issue of economics, and we did touch on that a little earlier, but I'm going to go into a little bit more detail. Of course, there's something very fundamentally apparent to me. The IMF, the World Bank, the World Trade Organizations, the transnational corporations seem to have a vested interest in creating debt traps for small nations. And a debt trap seems to be the fundamental beginning of a hybrid war as well. I'm going to ask Marcus for his comments on what Azad said, but this idea of economics being used as a hybrid warfare tool, how true is that?
Oh, I think it's abundantly true. I think there are so many case studies that we can cite to fully corroborate that, because the economic aspect of American foreign policy, or in this case, American hybrid warfare, is absolutely crucial. As you said, many countries are on their knees because of, for example, American sanctions. And then the Americans instigate a coup in that country, their people come to power, and one way the Americans see to it that that country never falls out of their grip is to start using IMF loans, or to use the IMF, which is a formidable, potent weapon of the American government, to get the IMF to give loans to that country. And the Americans, they're many things, but they are financial geniuses, and we have to respect that. They are exceptionally good at economics, and they know how to entrap a country, a nation, a people indefinitely, because it's not just the loans that that country has to pay off, it is the debt, it is the interest on top of that. So that is why, if there is no IMF, if there is no economic dimension to American foreign policy, then America would not be the supreme power that it is in the world today.
Thank you, Marcus. We've got a little video which I'd like to run again, and then we'll engage around this issue. The word education comes to mind. We touched on that a little earlier, but I'm going to turn to the hybrid warfare via education after this short video.
این همه لشکر آمده بگید نرم حضورمون در این مجل به عشق ولایت، به عشق امامت و رهبری، به عشق ولی امر مسلمین جهان bir birleşen gelir, rehbere yolda gelir, bir birleşen gelir. Başarma, bir birleşen gelir. Milletimiz ayakdır. Milletimiz ayakdır. Milletimizden uzaktır. Mecbur fitnegar. Mecbur fitnegar. Mecbur Amerika. Mecbur Amerika. Mecbur zikr vilayet el-faqih. Ey anke peygamber rah yatim ameni.
I do love the way the Islamic Republic responds to these things. Death to America, I'm reliably told, and certainly Ayatollah Khamenei has pointed it out again this week, very emphatically. They mean death to the regime. They mean death to the system, the corrupt, if you like, system that America represents in terms of its kind of destruction of other sovereignty, destruction of other people's culture, rape of economic resources. It's not death to America as in the people, it's death to America as in the capitalist, hyper-capitalist system that they promote and they serve and they roll out and impose around the world. Let's get that one out of the way, because that video, Morana, was, I think, the streets of Tehran. That's the response of the Iranian public to the latest protests. The Iranians have become very clever at the way they tackle this, because they shut down the internet, which is quite smart, because they know that's what they're going to use.
Yeah.
So what started off as genuine protests on the ground, people worried about this petrol taking away of the subsidy, and in fact, petrol in Iran is still one of the cheapest in the world, it has to be said. It's a good thing, partly because I think Iranians in Tehran certainly overuse the cars. I mean, and petrol and the pollution that results of that.
It has highest rate of consumption. And of course the pollution there is something which is a health hazard. So I think it's quite an astute move to actually make people pay a little bit more so that they use those cars a little less. There's a fantastic metro. I was there for 2 or 3 months, and the underground is wonderful, and the bus service is pretty cool. So why on earth people all want to jump in cars everywhere in traffic jams, which were horrendous, quite frankly, at times, is beyond me. But anyway, okay, the people have the right to protest. That's what Ayatollah Khamenei has also said. The establishment acknowledges that. It's when it gets hijacked then by groups which are ready, funded. The MKO in this incident is getting is being incriminated. They had sniper weapons. Yeah. They've had incendiary devices that they've been chucking into banks and throwing into public offices. This is not protesting against austerity. If I did that here in Britain, I'd be locked up, and rightly so. You know, if we did that in anywhere in the world, it would be great. But of course, the Western media has gone on the front foot saying that the Iranians are clamping down, and then the exaggeration begins, which is again part of the hybrid warfare. It's building collateral to exaggerate even the protests that exist. I think about the Yellow Jackets in France. I didn't hear Mr. Pompeo or Trump turn around and say that Mr. Macron should be overthrown and the entire French government should be overthrown. He didn't interfere within that set of protests, which were a genuine set of protests as far as I can see. But when it comes to Iran or Lebanon, they're very quick to jump on it, which gives away the game, that they actually have a political agenda there. Tell me a little bit more about the Islamic Republic's response and the mechanisms against this kind of cyber warfare or this kind of hybrid warfare. What have they learned, and how do they respond to it? I've personally lived in Iran during all these protests, and I've witnessed what happens. I mean, whenever America or the Western countries, they incite people to come on the streets. Immediately, the Rahbar, the leader or the authorities, announce a counter demonstration, and the masses of people who attend in those demonstrations are far greater than these mini or tiny demonstrations. So this is what America cannot handle or cannot deal with it, because look at this response that people had given. And if these people decide to continuously stay on the streets, the others would not be able to confront with them.
Marcus, let's broaden it out. Britain is regularly complaining about cyber warfare and hybrid war, and they're usually pointing the finger at Russia or China. Those are the two they seem to go for. But they say, you know, that when you're pointing a finger at somebody, there are usually three fingers pointing back at you. How involved are we in Britain or the West generally in this kind of business of regime change through hybrid warfare, and how much are we moaning and groaning at the Russians and actually creating dragons where they don't exist?
Well, first of all, we need to acknowledge that no country, no government is an angel.
Yeah.
All countries, or most powerful countries, most powerful governments in the world are utilising the weapon of cyber warfare. Let's just be absolutely categorically clear.
They're not infallibles.
Absolutely, absolutely. But for Britain to simply say that it's Russia that is behind it all the time, or China is not far behind Russia, is really ludicrous, because we have seen many examples where cyber warfare has been used against countries which, surprise, surprise, are in geostrategic parts of the world, follow an independent foreign policy, are hostile to American foreign policy, and will not submit to the diktats of the American empire. And we know as well that the British Intelligence Service is one of the most powerful, one of the most formidable anywhere in the world, and they are using cyber warfare to great effect. So anyone who says that it's Russia or it's China is either an idiot, if I have to be crude, or they are simply lying. And in my opinion, most of the people at Westminster or Whitehall who claim that Britain would never delve into that sort of activity are simply lying. They know very, very well just how beneficial cyber warfare is, not just to British foreign policy, not just to American foreign policy, but to ensuring the survival of Western global hegemony.
Well, it's good to put it all out there that it's a reality. The average person on the street, I'm again trying to go to the average person, they aren't that adept at politics or economics or these kind of let alone these kind of covert operations that go on. They might buy into a lot of this fear-mongering. We had it in the Cold War. Russia was the big bad bear, and then suddenly when it became supposedly liberated, it was a lovely, lovely cuddly bear, and now it's turning back into the grizzly bear again. I mean, it really is a little bit Hansel Gretel and sort of the Brothers Grimm. Are we treated generally as a public? Are we treated as kind of ignorant, illiterate little kids, and we're played with?
Much to my shame, it has to be said, and I will say this very clearly, that the average British person is unbelievably ignorant about politics, and is even more ignorant about foreign policy, because foreign policy to the average British person is exactly that. It is foreign. And this ignorance, this complete lack of enlightenment amongst ordinary British people plays into the hands of the British establishment, because it is not in the interests of the British elite to have an enlightened population when it comes to politics and economics and media, because if the British public are enlightened, then they're not going to believe what they hear on Sky News and BBC News or The Guardian about Iran or China or Russia. And that is the difference between the average person in Britain and the average person in, for example, Iran. Because the average person in Iran, man or woman and children, they take an interest in politics. That is a big part of culture in Iran, but it's not a part of British culture, and that is a great pity, and it just plays into the hands of this tiny group of people in Britain who are controlling our lives from birth to grave without most people in Britain even realising that. They are being manipulated every day of their lives when they open a newspaper or when they put their television on and they see Sky News or BBC News.
So you're coming back to education, and I did promise we'd go back to that. But let me quote Martha, I think it was Martha Gellhorn, very fascinating quote. For those people who hate politics, because we had somebody in last week's programme who told us off for daring to use the term prophetic politics. He meant moral politics, and I hope that was dealt with. Islam certainly is political, it certainly has a politics, and it's a moral politics, we would argue. But Martha says something interesting. She says, people often say with pride, I'm not interested in politics. They might as well say, I'm not interested in my standard of living, my health, my job. I'm not interested in my rights, nor my freedoms, nor my future, or any future at all. If we mean to keep any control of over our world and lives, we must be interested in politics. Very powerful, and it's very, very poignant and true. Maulana, this idea of let's bring moral politics. Is it moral to engage in hybrid warfare? Then I'm going to come on to the education issue as well. Is it morally right for governments to engage in hybrid warfare? Arguably, a state that's under attack from covert hybrid warfare would say, well, we have to use the same techniques, otherwise we're going to get overthrown. So is it legitimate?
As Brother Marcus was saying, Iran, for example, in Iran and Middle East, the youth and youngsters are far more educated in politics than these countries. And if they decide to get involved in hybrid war and they properly train their youth, the Western world would not survive in front of them. But they don't use dirty. The difference is they don't use dirty politics.
I mean, what that dirty politics might mean is that in Britain, rather like the Israeli lobby, we could buy up lobby groups, pay for large groups to go into Parliament and lobby parliamentarians as the friends of the Conservative Party or the friends of Israel in the Conservative Party or the Labour Party, and such very powerful lobby groups already do. We know about Policy Exchange and Henry Jackson Society, and many of these neoconservative lobby groups which come in and actually dictate British foreign policy or even defence policy to a great extent, from what I've picked up. That's, in a way, dirty politics. It's underhand. It undermines the British public and the electorate, because I don't think the British electorate really want to support, for instance, Israeli killing of Palestine. I don't think any of the British public voted for the Iraq War. I don't think the British public ever actually voted for any foreign war in my living memory. I don't think that's why they voted in their governments, but we still got it. It seems as though democracy has flaws, and one of the major ones is the ignorance of people and the lack of education about politics and how to work out what politicians are doing, and even to know the mechanism of our parliament and not to presume it's straightforward. I'm going to come to Marcus in a minute because he virtually lives in parliament, so he's the expert on this. But how can we educate our children about something which is so dry? I used to say once upon a time that science was really dry in the 70s. Anybody who tried to put a science program, people wouldn't watch it. They wanted to watch the other entertainment. But, you know, they made science quite sexy, if, for want of a better term.
Making films in Hollywood about it. So
yeah, so now science fiction seems to have introduced scientific ideas and other ways. Can we make politics more interesting or economics more interesting so that people are more educated about it?
Yes, I mean, of course. I mean, from Islamic point of view, as long as you take care of the moral side of it, it's okay to transfer your ideology, and practically this is what Iran has been doing. I mean, like Hezbollah and they would support any oppressed people around the world. And they would encourage them to stand for their rights. So in that way they can and they will and they might be even doing the hybrid war against other countries. But they wouldn't certainly go to the extent of America or other countries who are just so selfish. They don't care what happens to the country as long as their aims are achieved.
Marcus, this issue of education, how would you educate even the British public or generally people to be more savvy about what really goes on, what really happens in the world? I mean, if we're living in an illusion created by the political system, how is it that we can break out there, given that that education system is also produced by the same political system, and it arguably doesn't want to teach this politics, this economics, this psychology, this understanding of the world, you know, wisdom, as I would call it. They don't want wise thinking individuals, it seems. They want consumers and producers. They're certainly producing those. How do we challenge that? Is it possible? Because if kids are programmed from an early age not to be political, not to be engaged, and then they're scared of doing it by the law later on. Prevent is a policy I could cite as an example of that. We talk about China and the Uyghurs, for instance, and the Muslim oppression of the Uyghurs, but we don't talk about the oppression of Muslims and through prevent and counter-terrorism laws here in this country. That's again another sort of like a kind of a dissonance, a sort of it's a sort of knowledge difference which is there that people seem to mix up. How would you tackle this issue of education?
Well, I think anything is possible, though this is going to be extremely difficult to introduce into the British education system. But my own view is that politics and world history should be introduced to children in primary school, because that is a crucial time in a child's development. I'm not saying that they should be taught about politics to a GCSE level or an A level, or world history to a GCSE or an A level, but they should be told that politics is all around us. Politics is school, having good schools, having a good education system. Politics is jobs, politics is health, politics is ensuring that your children adhere to the right values in life. They know the difference between right and wrong, and teaching them at a young age about world history, about other countries in the world, other cultures in the world, other religions in the world. I think if you really overhaul the education system in this country and start teaching children about politics and world history, and encourage them to think independently, encourage children to question other people. It doesn't matter that I'm white and I wear a suit and I'm at Parliament. Question me, because I'm infallible. We all make mistakes. So question. And the problem is that the Houses of Parliament, what you see is that these people there, be it politicians and members of the press gallery, of which I'm a member of, they are archetypal people who have been brought up in this country and who have developed into being what I call weathercocks. Because whatever direction the wind is going in, they go in that direction. If the wind is in the direction of Iran is a bad country, the Iranian Revolution is evil, then most of them are going to go in that direction. Very few people, very few politicians, even less members of the parliamentary press gallery are what I call signposts. They have set convictions, and they will take those convictions with them to the grave, and they point in one direction and they are not going to be moved. But that comes down to a person's education. That comes down to how a person was brought up by their parents. If they were brought up in a very cultured environment, if education was, made number one priority at home, then it's more than likely those people are going to develop into enlightened adults. But if they haven't experienced that at home, then they are just going to be what I call weathercocks.
Good point to finish the show on. hybrid warfare is a reality. There are many ways and shapes and forms it comes to. Do some more homework on that, because you're in the middle of an election here in Britain as well. It's really necessary for you to know the depth and the detail of what's going on. Otherwise, you too could be a victim of hybrid warfare. Do you remember that quote which Farage and company gave about how the NHS was going to be £325,000 a week or whatever, or a day, some ridiculous figure, better off? Well, they all admitted they were lying. That was hybrid warfare, because it affected the way people voted at that time in that referendum. Don't be mugs, don't be victims, be clued up, understand politics far better, and do it with a moral compass that actually wants justice at the end of the day. That's certainly what the Islamic message is, and it's certainly what all our brothers in humanity are fighting for. And I thank Dr. Marcus Papadopoulos for joining us, and commend you on your work in Parliament. Do look up Politics First. It's a great place to begin your education about the real politics of not only this country but globally. And I hope you Google Dr. Marcus Papadopoulos and get in touch with him perhaps, and help and support his work there. One of the little fountains of truth there within that structure known as the mother of all parliaments. I might beg to differ at times, but there you go. That's all from us this week. Join us next week again for Open Dialogue, when we'll actually probably be converting into a programme title called Critical Eye. That's our new title. Thank you for joining us. Thank you, Maulana.